Good afternoon to you all. My name is Jan Daniel. I'm a researcher at the Institute of International Relations Prague, and I would like to welcome you to the panel Building Sustainable Future in the European Neighborhood After ISIS, Post-Conflict Justice, Reintegration and Development in Syria and Iraq. Although the title of the panel sounds quite complicated, the main issue that it speaks about is actually quite simple. From 2014 until 2018, we were constantly hearing about the threat of so-called Islamic State, or ISIS, a jihadist group terrorizing and occupying large territories in Syria and Iraq and committing attacks in the rest of the world. Well, now, when ISIS is supposedly defeated, the world attention turned elsewhere. However, its victims, some of its fighters, their families, and the destruction that the group left behind are still there in Syria and Iraq. So the question posed to this panel is actually quite straightforward. What to do about the problems that are still existing on the ground in the territories that ISIS used to control? What to do with the victims of the group? Is there some support for them? Will they get some justice? What to do with ISIS fighters and their families? Some of them are still being held in the camps. Should they be brought to justice? And if so, who and how should do that? And what about the overall reconstruction? Do we know what to focus on, how to do it well to prevent ISIS from coming back, to exploit some of the disenchantment of the people still living in the destructed areas? And finally, is there some role for the smaller states, such as the Czech Republic, to contribute to these efforts? Is there something that we know well what to do? Is there something that we can actually do to, let's say, reconstruct Iraq and Syria better? To answer these questions, and actually more, we have a terrific lineup of speakers. First, we have Mr. Lukáš Gjurič of the Middle East and North Africa Department of the Czech Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Maybe we'll also have Ilhan Kizilhan, psychologist and trauma expert, well known for his work with Yazidi victims of ISIS, who will hopefully join us later. We have Ulrich Garms, program officer at the Terrorism Prevention Branch of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crimes. Hello to Vienna. Fourth, we have Petra Ditrichová, an expert on international law at the Ministry of Defense of Czech Republic and also my home institution, Institute of International Relations. And finally, we have Martin Kocian, a regional director for the Middle East at the biggest Czech NGO, People in Need, who is also active in Iraq and Syria. Since the time frame is unfortunately really tight, I would like to ask our panelists to keep their remarks ideally under 10 minutes. And I would like to remind our audience that we'll be accepting your questions via Slido. Now, without further ado, I would like to pass the floor to Mr. Gjurič. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you and good afternoon to everybody. I was asked to provide you a short overview of the Czech Republic's activities in the region, which is struggling with a huge humanitarian and political fallout, including the unsolved political conflict in Syria, and of course a massive wave of displaced persons, as well as destruction of material infrastructure. The Czech Republic is trying to play its part within the EU as a whole. And although we do have contributions of military and police experts to the respective missions in Iraq, the main emphasis of our assistance is in humanitarian and stabilization aid to the region as a whole. For 2020, the value of our aid is projected to reach about 8 million USD. Although a majority of our aid flows into Syria and Iraq themselves, more than a quarter of the total sum is allocated to Jordan and Lebanon, which host millions of chiefly Syrian refugees, and of course deserve our maximum international solidarity in this regard, especially as the prospect of a comprehensive repatriation of the refugees remains distant. Our aid is tailored to local needs. In Lebanon, where refugees are more dispersed, we provide capacity support to the national health and school systems, which bear the burden of care for refugees. In Jordan, aid is more concentrated in refugee camps. In Iraq, the main urgency is shifting of the international community is shifting a little bit now from IDPs to repatriated persons and their host communities, which often already suffer from extensive damage to physical infrastructure. A significant part of our aid attempts to assist the Iraqi government in revitalizing some of this infrastructure before the government can fully cover those needs through its own complex reconstruction effort. One problem we face in administering assistance to Iraq is a kind of rule of law crisis in the country, where corruption and administrative chaos remain a significant problem. And NGO personnel carrying out aid projects in the country have repeatedly faced obstruction, both in the administrative process and in some cases in their physical movements across the country. The EU as a whole is pressuring the Iraqi government to impose clear rules allowing NGOs to operate smoothly, and has recently received new promises in this regard. Iraq is different from the other recipient countries in that its oil wealth potentially allows it to carry a substantial part of the reconstruction burden itself, and the international community is trying to push it to a more active approach. The problem is that a huge part of the government's budget is already tied up by expenditures on a vastly outsized bureaucracy and underperforming tax system, corruption, and other inefficiencies. This is a legacy of political practice in Iraq in the past 17 years. So the outlook for reconstruction is closely tied to wider issues of economic and legal reform, and the current government has undertaken to pursue these. Syria, in many ways, is the greatest challenge, since so much of the humanitarian crisis, including reconstruction and the repatriation of refugees, is connected to the wider political resolution of the conflict. In this situation, the Czech Republic concentrates on humanitarian aid to IDPs and repatriated persons, with a few assistance projects of a more durable kind, such as hospital or sanitation equipment. The latter areas face an additional challenge from the unfortunate attempts by some external powers to limit the transborder supply of aid to opposition territories. For example, a recent UN Security Council resolution has limited the transborder access of UN-administered aid to the northeastern territories to a single crossing from Turkey. Finally, briefly on transitional justice efforts, which are taking place in parallel to the humanitarian effort. The Czech Republic supports, of course, the full investigation and prosecution of all serious crimes committed during the war, both in Syria and Iraq. The IIIM mechanism, of which you will probably hear or have heard from more qualified participants, has been mandated by the UN General Assembly. It only has a mandate to collect evidence on war crimes in Syria, but in the absence of a clear way for impartial legal prosecution, either in Syria or by the International Criminal Court, we see this as both very welcome and urgent, since the evidence is in danger of being obliterated with time. The Czech Republic provides regular financial support to this mechanism. And in the case of Iraq, there's a UNITAD mechanism to investigate the crimes of ISIL, mandated by the UN Security Council. It not only serves a similar purpose as the aforementioned, but also enjoys the active support and cooperation of the Iraqi government, which is lacking in the Syrian case. And its collected evidence has a clear way to being implemented in legal action. Again, the Czech Republic fully supports its efforts, and I am more than happy to answer any questions you may have on our activities. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks for this, as I said, thanks for this introduction, and please can we now move to Mr. Ulrich Garms to provide his remarks from the point of view of UN Office on Drugs and Crimes.
Yes, indeed. Thank you so much, Jan, Daniel, and dear fellow panelists, dear participants. Let me start by thanking the Institute of International Relations for extending an invitation to the UN Office on Drugs and Crime to the Symposium on Czech Foreign Policy. I was very much looking forward to coming to Prague, where I think I haven't been since 1995. But it is equally a pleasure to be connected to you remotely for this panel, which touches on an extremely important and very, very challenging topic. As our moderator has mentioned, my name is Ulrich Garms and I work in the terrorism prevention branch of UNODC. Before I get into the substance, let me just say a word about UNODC, because I suspect not everyone may be familiar with this very medium-sized, let's say, part of the UN Secretariat, in spite of the geographic proximity, as we are based in Vienna. The UN Office on Drugs and Crime has been existing for 2 decades, and its mandate is to assist member states to make the world safer from drugs, organized crime, corruption, and terrorism. And to do that, and considering the scale of the problem, UNODC offers practical assistance to member states to improve their criminal justice systems, their crime prevention, and international cooperation. We do that from Vienna, but particularly through a network of field offices in all around the world. What I was going to do is to highlight that there is a series of frameworks with which we can think about these issues of accountability, justice, and their links to reintegration and development. One is, of course, the counterterrorism framework, where I was going to highlight that from an approach focused on bringing to justice terrorists, we have now the approach which still has, of course, that element, but which is broader, and it's the so-called PRR strategies, prosecution, rehabilitation, and reintegration strategies, and which are necessary both for persons, so-called foreign terrorist fighters and their families returning home, but which are also very important when we think about people in the region, or people returning from Syria to Iraq, possibly. I was going to speak very briefly about the need for particular attention to women and children, not having stereotypes about women's roles on the one hand, and also recognizing that they can be perpetrators, but on the other hand, the need to not forget the women who are victims of sexual and gender-based violence by these groups, which is, of course, not a risk when we talk about IIIM and UNITAD, but which, when we talk about the counterterrorism framework, which is the main framework for the domestic authorities in Iraq to approach this, there is a risk that the crimes committed against these women, and therefore also their need for support and reintegration support, are forgotten. I was going to speak about the children recruited. I was going to mention the key principles for the protection, repatriation, prosecution, rehabilitation, and reintegration of women and children with links to UN-listed terrorist groups that our Secretary General has issued in April 2019. And finally, I was going to mention, well, not finally, second but last, the transitional justice framework, and so to think not only about prosecution and about accountability also from that perspective, but about truth, reconciliation, guarantees of non-repetition, and so forth. And lastly, I was going to highlight that the Sustainable Development Goals, as opposed to the previous development framework, do very strongly in SDG 16 underline the link between reducing violence, delivering justice, combating corruption and terrorism, and the promotion of peaceful and inclusive societies, and from there on to sustainable development. Let me say One last thing on the UN side, of course, there's multiple actors.